Hello students, and welcome to this second video on the Industrial Revolution, where today we'll be looking at the first wave of the Industrial Revolution as it takes place in Great Britain, it's mostly a revolution in how textiles or clothing is produced. It occurs in the late 1700s and goes into the early 1800s. Tomorrow we'll be looking at the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, which is mostly focused on, say, steel, coal, and building railroads to help transport goods. And we'll tag on to that to the third wave of the Industrial Revolution, although that really occurs a bit later in European history. The questions for today are: why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Great Britain and not elsewhere? What industry did the first wave of the Industrial Revolution transform? What form of energy did this first wave of the Industrial Revolution rely on? And what were the advantages and the disadvantages of using machines to make clothing? So let's go ahead and get started. So the first wave of the Industrial Revolution is really focused in textiles, or the making of clothing. You can imagine that with all the clothing that you either outgrow or gets holes in it, you have to replace the clothing that you wear an awful lot. Fashions go in and out. So clothing is a wonderful industry for a country like Great Britain to really dominate, since everybody needs clothing. If you remember back to the Enclosure Acts, Britain had a lot of sheep, and sheep made lots of wool, and so British textile firms had a lot of cheap raw materials in the form of wool. Making textiles is mostly going to be based on mechanical looms that are powered by water. So you're going to use water wheels to turn fairly complicated series of gears that are going to do a wide variety of simple tasks over and over again when it comes to spinning clothing. And with this first wave of industrialization, you've got quick, rapid improvements that are made as inventors, as tinkers, as machinists come up with different improvements to existing machines so they become more and more efficient. The cost savings that these machines produce, as they're able to produce more clothing at a lower cost, allows the owners of these machines to become very, very rich. And it's going to spur on more innovations as textile owners or inventors, machinists, as they try to come up with some new invention that could perhaps improve the process and thereby earn them a small fortune. And we'll look at some of these people in some special videos that I've got embedded onto your Canvas page. I have a list here of a number of the more noteworthy mechanical looms that are invented during the Industrial Revolution. A lot of these are invented in the northern parts of England, known as York. York had a lot of rivers and streams and creeks in order to provide water power for these textile mills. They also had a lot of rolling fields for raising sheep. Of course, sheep produce wool, and wool is incredibly important for textiles and cloth making. So some of the more noteworthy inventions: the flying shuttle, weaving wider cloth, invented in 1733. 1765, the spinning jenny. Now that you have machines that spin 60 threads of cloth at the same time. 1769, you've got Richard Arkwright's the water frame, which adds water power to a similar machine as the spinning jenny, just to automate more of those tasks. 1779, you have Samuel Crompton is his name, but he combines the spinning jenny and the water frame to make a spinning mule, which spins cotton thread better than any other machine. So each of these machines here is really an advantage upon the one that preceded it, and allows for greater efficiency so that you can make more clothing in less time. And I do have some videos embedded into Canvas so that you can see these working on its own. 1781, Boulton and Watt are going to invent a steam engine for cotton factories. In wool factories, the steam engine is important because that allows you to build a factory away from a source of water. So you don't need a rushing creek or a rushing stream in order to power a wheel that then turns the series of gears inside your mill. Now you can have your textile mill, your factory, wherever you want it. So the industrialized economy, it's based on manufacturing. And once you have this huge surplus of goods, you're going to begin to trade those goods around the world. This begins in Great Britain, right? The Industrial Revolution, this industrialized economy, around 1750. And there's a lot of reasons why it begins in Great Britain as opposed to elsewhere. One, Britain has lots of rivers and lots of coastlines to facilitate trade. Britain's colonies give it access to a wide array of raw materials and a market for their goods. 1750, at this point, Great Britain is in control of most of the eastern seaboard of what is today the United States, from the colony of Massachusetts down to the down from the colony of Massachusetts down to the colony of Georgia. They have trading posts at Cape Town, on the coastline of the Indian subcontinent. They've discovered Australia. Right now, Britain is engaged in trade across the entire world. And so that gives them access to an array of raw materials and goods few other powers can boast of. They also have lots of raw materials like wool, and they have access to natural resources like coal and iron that are so pivotal to industrialization. This increased production also leads to new technologies that increase efficiency, and more production, more efficiency basically means more money into the hands of these factory owners, and they're able to reinvest that into their factories in order to improve them and thereby reap greater and greater efficiencies. Some more reasons why the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain. England had large deposits of natural resources like iron and coal. You've got banks in England that encouraged trade and inventions, and the banks in England were able to provide money to invest in new industries. England's colonies provided them with raw materials and markets to sell. So this nice little graphic here shows a lot of those reasons why the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain and not elsewhere. So, as stated, England had a fairly advanced banking system, and you're going to need banks to provide loans, right? Loans or capital, large amounts of money to people to start new businesses or new factories. In England as well, in Britain as well, you also have the rule of law protecting successful business owners from having their stuff stolen from them by the king or the local nobility. You have growing wealth from overseas trade. And lastly, if you remember back to the Napoleonic Wars, those are all fought in Europe. Those are fought in France. Those are fought in the Holy Roman Empire, what is today Germany. Those were fought in Russia. They weren't fought in Great Britain. So Great Britain's fields are never burned in order to deny Napoleon resources that he needs to feed his army. There's no battles that take place in the English countryside. England is largely spared of a lot of the devastation that occurs in much of Europe. Also, the American Revolution fought in America, not in Britain. So there's a lot of devastating conflicts that devastate other parts of the world, but not Britain. So these are some more reasons why the Industrial Revolution begins in Britain and not elsewhere. And I think one powerful reason why the Industrial Revolution begins in Britain and not elsewhere is that Britain is the birthplace of economics, largely the birthplace of economics. There are forerunners and thinkers like Aristotle and Aquinas as to what a just price really looks like and how people should ethically engage in the marketplace. But economics as we know it really begins in Scotland with the thinker Adam Smith. Remember from our unit on the Enlightenment that economics is going to be, it's the systematic study guided by the scientific method of commerce and industry, as well as looking at people's incentives as to why they do the things that they do. And all of this is about encouraging man's material prosperity. I mean, look at what we're seeing here in the Industrial Revolution, that we're having increased production, increased efficiency, we're having more goods at lower cost, at least in the textile industry. Previously, the main theory of the way that nations trade is called mercantilism. Mercantilism, the idea here is that wealth is finite, and so nations are really competing for limited amounts of gold and silver. So a nation like England is going to try to sell more goods to Spain than they buy from Spain, so that Spain has to give to England more gold and silver than England is giving to Spain. Along with this mercantilist bent, kings are going to sell the privilege, it's called a monopoly, of producing, buying, or selling a particular commodity. And if you're the merchant or the businessman that has bought that monopoly, you're going to be sitting pretty and making a lot of money. But everybody else who either has to buy your goods or is shut out of producing that good, they're going to be very upset. For me, the spirit animal of mercantilism is going to be a dragon. Dragons, if you know from mythology, are very greedy. They sleep on top of piles of gold, and they don't like to share with anybody else, and they get very upset if they're asked to do so. In the same way, these nations are acting like dragons, hoarding up as much gold and silver as they possibly can and refusing to share it with everybody else. On the other hand, the new theory, the one that's coming in vogue here with the new Industrial Revolution, is capitalism. Capitalism is the means of production, like a factory or land or a mine, that's going to be in the hand of private owners. It's not in the hands of the government. We're not going to have the king picking and choosing winners and losers, who gets to sell what and at what prices. The government doesn't get into issues like that. This is also called laissez-faire capitalism, which is the French word for let go. The idea here is that the government is really letting go and not actively directing the affairs in the marketplace. Rather, it's private individuals who are making those sorts of decisions. Part of the reason why this happens in Britain is that power in Britain now is vested in the British Parliament. You've got representatives that are drawn from the merchants, from prominent townspeople, from the landed nobility, from businessmen. You have a nice scattering of various interests in Britain, and they're getting to decide policy for the entire nation here. And what they want is a policy that's more favorable to business interests. As merchants grow wealthier, they're going to exert more influence in countries like Britain and in France. And that's really the meaning behind this photo right here of these birds in flight. There's not a single bird that's directing all of the birds flying in the same direction to the same spot as they migrate south for the winter. All of those birds are doing this independently. It's kind of random in that sense, in that there's no like overarching, there's no control. There's no single power that's directing all of those birds in flight. And yet they still move in the same direction at roughly the same speed. That sort of coordinated, concerted, organized effort. This is a wonderful picture of what capitalism looks like, as far as all of these different individuals making decisions in their own best interest that also benefit the interests of others. So, it is a little leading, but for mercantilism, the spirit animal is this dragon, and for capitalism, the spirit animal is going to be these birds in flight. Just a brief reminder here, too, about Adam Smith, 1723 to 1790. He's one of the foremost philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment, and it's his major work, The Wealth of Nations, coming in 1776, that's going to describe a lot of these changes that are taking place during the Industrial Revolution, as well as giving a number of principles that, once people enact them, is going to allow this incredible outburst of economic production and efficiency to take place. So some of those principles are going to include the division of labor, which is where you take, that's funny, my face has replaced Adam Smith up here. But anyway, division of labor, you're going to take a complicated job, and you're going to break it down into a series of smaller and simpler tasks. So think about in the Industrial Revolution, where you are taking a complicated task like weaving an entire thing of cloth and bringing it down to smaller steps so that you can increase efficiencies. You have something called the comparative advantage, where countries should focus on what they do best in and what they have the smallest opportunity cost in doing, and then trade for the goods that they need. So a country like England might really, really focus on, say, textiles, or in other regions of England on coal and steel production. And they're going to trade for the goods that they need with other individuals. And lastly, you've got the invisible hand. So this is an idea that Adam Smith introduces, that the market and all of the people participating in that marketplace, they're actors. The entire economy is so complicated that no one person could ever really direct all of its workings. Instead, the market works as if guided by an invisible hand, that such a large number of people, each individually pursuing their own best interests, is really going to bring about the best interest for society as a whole. This is Adam Smith's argument for how free trade is going to not only help individuals prosper, but could also bring. So to recap, the first wave of the Industrial Revolution is centered on textiles and making clothing. Clothing used to be woven by hand, either by guilds, which was expensive, or by peasants in the countryside, what was known as the putting out system. And that's still expensive. During the Industrial Revolution, you're going to have advances in machines that are going to do that cloth weaving for people. Inventors, business owners, entrepreneurs, these are people who take on the risks of starting a new business. They're going to invent machines that cut down on the amount of time needed to weave clothing. And these machines could weave way more wool in a day than a worker ever could. And thanks to the increased efficiency, the owners, right, the inventors, the entrepreneurs, these individuals are going to grow very rich. The workers, not so much. Because remember, these machines, they're going to replace a ton of jobs, as you don't need a large workforce to weave wool into finished cloth anymore. These machines are going to break down, and in breaking down, they may hurt someone. Even if they don't break down, if you get your finger caught in one of them, you're going to get hurt. If you have a lot of small moving parts as well, it's kind of hard for a large adult-sized person to get in there and fix that machine. Many factory owners are going to start hiring children, as young as 6, to fix these machines or to work on them and make sure that they don't break down. Lastly, these machines shoot out a ton of dust, woolen fibers, and other particles into the air, and make the living conditions in these factories, the working conditions in these factories, practically unbearable. So this slide here really gives a nice view of the advantages and the disadvantages of making clothing by machines. You have increased efficiency, which does lower the cost of goods, but you also have some of these unforeseen consequences. It replaces a ton of jobs, and those people are going to be out of work. And in breaking down, they could hurt someone. And some of the factory conditions are not desirable, to say the least. So going back to those questions, you'll have a quiz, a couple of steps forward in your module. So just look at these questions here. Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Great Britain? What industry did the first wave of the Industrial Revolution transform? What form of energy did this first wave of the Industrial Revolution rely on? And what are the advantages and the disadvantages of using machines to make clothing? All right, thanks so much, everybody, and have a wonderful day.